Thank you for coming to our virtual information session. My name is Hannah, and I'm very glad that you're all taking the time out of your evening to learn about what our organization does and what your end of life options are. I always like to start this presentation off with reviewing our agenda of why natural burial. So I will begin with kind of a brief summary of who we are as Foxfield Preserve, the history of our organization, as well as the history of burial trends. And then I will define natural burial, how we interpret it at Foxfield. Then I'll review the impact of natural burial. This will be a review of its environmental impact, the personal benefits, and how it is an opportunity to create meaningful legacies. Then I break up the natural burial process into three different sections: before a burial, during a burial, and after the burial. I will close with your natural burial options. I like to do this at the very end because these are going to be the products that you potentially could consume, and there will be examples of what those things are. For example, what is a shroud? I will have a photo for you at the end and kind of explain how those are used. Then we'll open with a Q&A and follow up with next steps. If you're interested in learning more about Foxfield or whatever you may be interested in learning more about. So this is actually a photo of Foxfield Preserve well before it was a nature preserve. It had been a dilapidated farmstead for many decades, and I don't exactly know when it was acquired, but the Wilderness Center, who is our partner organization, received this land as part of a sale donation, and they began to convert it into a 43-acre restored native hardwood forest, as well as native prairie landscape. And so Foxfield Preserve today has quite a bit of natural growth on it. There are trees that have been growing there for at least 40 years. And we continue to add to that growth with new plantings, sponsored in part by the families. And we also have very lush prairies. It looks nothing like any cemetery that you are familiar with. We are dominated by wildflowers, pollinators, native creatures. It is all a transformed space that teems with life compared to what was once, hills of farmstead, and comparatively to solemn, sullen cemeteries that you see today that have very little green space in it other than manicured lawns. The mission of Foxfield Preserve is to provide our community with an environmentally friendly alternative to modern burial, while preserving natural lands and providing sustainable funding for conservation and nature education programs. I like to kind of share that mission so that you know where we're coming from with this. We are not just another business trying to persuade you in terms of pocket lining. We are really in this industry to use natural burial as a tool for good, as a way to give back to the community, and also to protect spaces into perpetuity. We are able to do this because of our partnership with the Wilderness Center. We were the very first conservation burial ground in Ohio. We were the third in the nation overall when we opened in 2008. And because of that partnership, we were the first in the nation to actually be partnered with a conservation entity. Up until that point, the two previous conservation burial grounds had only selected other nonprofits that they gave dividends to or that they supported. We really became the model in which other conservation burial grounds opened with, one that had that conservation mindset completely integrated into their organization. And so now that you have a little bit of context into what Foxfield Preserve is, I'm going to jump ahead into the history of burial practices. And so we have to start really, really far back because from the dawn of man, we have seen signs that a ritualistic return to the earth and burial tradition was embraced by early humans. Some of the earliest evidence of this was found in 2021 with the remains of Matoto. Um, his remains are dated back to about 78,000 years ago. And I think that this is a nice starting point because it shows that we have felt a very deep connection to the earth and the concept of returning to it. And that theme has been carried out through millennia, regardless of what we have done. We have been compelled to return to the earth. And prior to the 1860s, almost everybody was. Granted, there were a few different customs and traditions throughout the world, but the vast majority of burial traditions up until this time were all done as home funerals and natural burials. So, what did a home funeral really look like? This was the opportunity for um, death to be a constant conversation. It was always in our communities and it required community level care. We took care of our dead from washing it, dressing, and laying out for wakes. We invited friends and families to come in and share in those memories of our loved one, to share in the labors of death. And these community members would support these families in many different ways. They could build the casket, they could sew the shroud, they may even help dig graves. Sometimes, even the children in the neighborhood might be sent to gather wildflowers. Um, this was a place where everybody saw death not as something unknown to them. It was very familiar to them because they were the ones who had to be in charge of it. We start to see a shift in how we are handling death during the Civil War. Um, During this time period of roughly 1861 to 1865, we are seeing mass casualties due to the war effort on our home front more regularly than we had in the past. And wealthy families were willing to pay for the bodies of their sons to be returned to them. But prior to having any sort of refrigeration technology to the scale needed, this is going to create some real problems. Heat and humidity with train cars for many mile voyages are going to create some really awful, awful situations that need to be remedied. And so, enterprising entrepreneurs try to solve this problem by experimenting with a few different techniques to preserve the body. The one that takes off is known as embalming, specifically arsenic-based embalming. This is a way to preserve the tissues by replacing the blood in the body with this chemical solution. And it delays the effects of decay long enough for the bodies to be returned to their families and for the families to do a funeral in their local communities. This idea took off and it led to embalming tents being pitched alongside the battlefields at almost every site. And as soon as somebody fell, they were taken to that tent to be embalmed and then loaded up on that train ride home. So, how does this war practice become the cultural movement that it is? Why are we still doing it in 2023? I think a lot of the popularity boom is associated with one cultural figure who plays the significant role in raising it from a war practice to a sign of wealth and intelligence and, you know, decorum. And that's Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, He plays a big role in embalming in general, with different legislation, trying to regulate some of the embalming practices happening during the Civil War. And he also chooses embalming for his 11-year-old son, Willie, when he passes. But the biggest contributor to the popularity boom of embalming has to be when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated himself. And so after his assassination, he was embalmed and he was put on a train car for a multi-day journey home to Illinois. During this time, the train is making stops in several different cities, and the citizens are able to come and see the president for the first time, but also perhaps an embalmed body for the first time. And it is put out to them on a stage of grandeur. It is put to them as this is what you have to do to show respect to somebody you care for. And his services are quite elaborate. And so this is the big stage, and it sets the tone for other people to want to follow. One of the other things that I could argue leads to a popularity boom in how we talk about a changed death culture has to do with the rise of germ theory and medicalization and more hospitals opening, because death is no longer just happening inside of people's homes. It's happening inside of hospitals as well, behind closed doors and in the hands of doctors and nurses, other professionals. And so we are seeing death less and less often. We are handling it ourselves less and less often. We are trading in how do we tend for our sick and dying to professionals, and we're also handing our dead off to professionals. And that is creating a disconnect between skills that we had previously had for millennia. With the rise of the embalming industry and the funeral industry as a whole, we start to see another industry pop up, which is the advertising industry. Embalmers are looking for more ways to integrate themselves fully into a consumer's mind, to sell more than just their service of embalming. They need a way to sell products to families to earn a profit. They also need to sell additional services. So we see a change in terminology. Embalmers go into your home and they help you undertake the planning for funerals. They help you contact the chapel. They help you find a cemetery. They will build the casket for you. They become undertakers of the tasks. We also see them pushing different products like cemetery vaults. A vault is known as a kind of outer container, usually metal or concrete or a mix of the two, that was advertised as a means of protecting the body from elements in addition to the casket. So it would protect it from the earth, it would protect it from water. Perhaps it could even be airtight to slow decomposition. Or in another scare tactic and fear-mongering way, it would appeal to people's fears on grave robbings and say this will prevent grave robbings from happening. Burial vaults really don't do any of those things. It is primary use is to make greater burial density within cemeteries, because you can essentially pack people in like sardines when you have lots of vaults, and it prevents the ground in these cemeteries from sinking under the weight of the movement of heavy machinery used in the digging process. It also keeps that landscape quite smooth and easy to mow and manicure. There are no laws in the state of Ohio or of any state that I know of that requires you to have a vault. It is usually a cemetery's laws or cemetery rules and regulations that require a vault. primarily for the care and maintenance of the cemetery. Water will still get into burial vaults. If they were airtight, they would pop. If, you know, and this idea of needing to protect your loved one from the elements again makes us feel disconnected from the idea of returning to the earth. And so advertising industry comes in, more services are pushed, funerals keep leaving the home, and we're seeing very, very, very few regulations coming in for consumers. Now, these undertakers and embalmers and funeral directors are starting to regulate themselves. They're starting to create different codes and licenses, but nothing to protect the consumer from being taken advantage of during this time of advertising appeals. That is when, in the 1960s, we start to see some questioning of why is the funeral industry the way it is? Why is it so expensive? Why is it so hush hush? And primarily, the person responsible for engaging us in this conversation is Jessica Mitford. Jessica Mitford is a British American journalist, and she became fascinated with how Americans do death, because embalming and vaults and caskets like this are not common in other parts of the world. This is a uniquely American experience, the way we do death. And her book exposes many different aspects of the industry that caused people to pause. And I will say that her book raises consumer awareness of what their rights were, what their rights could and should be, and promotes the rise of simple, low-cost funerals. You can also thank Jessica Mitford's book for promoting the idea of cremation, which is now the most popular option in the US. Overall, her book was very, very foundational in the conversation of consumer advocacy groups. And later during the 1960s, throughout the 1990s, we see different consumer alliances form, and the Federal Trade Commission finally steps in and imposes different trade and price regulation requirements on the industry. Even in 2023, we are still having conversations on the funeral rule, which is something the FTC put out in the 1980s to help make sure that consumers knew their rights. Tomorrow on the 7th, there is going to be a conversation with the FTC on the funeral rule, stating that funeral homes will need to potentially put their generalized price list in an accessible form on their website. Will it include green burial in its different regulation forms? And so these are conversations that are still happening. And if you have questions on what your rights are, there are different funeral consumer groups that will help you figure out what your rights are. That brings me down to today and the green future that we are currently working towards. And so in the 1990s, we see the first conservation burial ground open up. I really hesitate to call what we do as conservation burial grounds or natural burial grounds, or really anything in the alternative death care community, as new or found ideas, because these practices have always been happening. Even during the Civil War, when we see the rise of embalming, there are still people and cultures choosing to bury their loved ones in a natural way for different cultural or religious reasons. And to gloss over that history and that significance of that cultural decision really greenwashes the whole thing. It's very appropriative. And so I like to say that this industry that I'm in as Foxfield Preserve is a renaissance of some of these ideas. It is creating a tool set to further natural conservation ideas. So we see the first one open in the 1998. Then Foxfield opens 10 years later in 2008. And we see different kind of consumer groups open up. The National Home Funeral Alliance in 2010, whose mission is to try and reteach some of those skills to families on how to take care of your dead at home. In 2020, the Conservation Burial Alliance is established to connect our communities and groups. And today, about 350 natural burial grounds exist in the US and Canada. And there are over 10 designated conservation burial grounds. There are a few more that are in the process of being certified, but there are 10 designated right now. There is a difference between a natural burial ground and a conservation burial ground, which is what I'm going to get into next. When you're researching what your options are for natural burial, you might see a lot of different terminology pop up. You might see something called a hybrid cemetery. So I'm going to start there because it's the lowest level of natural possible. In almost any conventional cemetery, not all, but most, they will offer you a natural burial, meaning no embalming, and your burial container could be natural material like bamboo or pine, something like that. However, they will often require something like a grave liner, which would be a bottomless but still concrete shell that will make that heavy machinery move across the cemetery just fine, but will allow your body to return to the earth. Oftentimes, these natural burial sections are just the unused parts of the cemetery. They are not well planned. They don't have native species on it. They do not have conservation management plans. They are like just the unmowed part, in the back corner. This is a great option if you want a natural burial for perhaps a religious reason. Say you are Jewish, but you don't have access to a Jewish cemetery in your community, and you would like to remain close by. A conventional cemetery that is hybrid could offer you this service of returning your body to the earth as naturally as you have access to. The second option that you may see when you are researching is a natural burial ground. This is your basic set. This is a cemetery that does not allow any non-biodegradable materials. They do not allow the use of toxic chemical embalming, and they use sustainable practices to minimize the impact on the earth. And so some of these cemeteries may be in a beautiful forest or in a beautiful meadow, and they may have some sensitive plants that they're trying to protect on that burial ground. However, these places lack land protection in the meaningful way that conservation burial grounds do. Conservation burial grounds, which is the third option, use natural burial as a tool to protect the land and to protect it into perpetuity. We have what is known as a conservation easement on that property, which is a legal binding document that regulates what can and cannot happen. So you can plant native things, you cannot plant non-native things. You can have a trail, but you cannot have a asphalt trail. It must be stone. Different regulatory actions imposed on that property to keep it in a natural state. So when you combine a conservation easement with cemetery law, you essentially get a gridlocked piece of land. No development can happen on it. There will be no poltergeist moment when the headstones are removed. Okay? The other two options, that risk still exists. It's unlikely, but it still exists. Conservation burial grounds, as some people say, are like chaining yourself to a tree in the afterlife. It is that strong of a method of protecting a piece of property. We also use those easements in conjunction with a conservation team to come up with land management plans that uphold best practices for that land, for those native species, for those pollinator habitats. And oftentimes, these business models, these conservation burial grounds, want the community to be part of that conservation conversation. They will have groups come out and do birding on it. They will do guided hikes. They will do seed collections on those properties. They are really about conserving that piece of land for its human nature connection, not just the business of burial. So, what is a natural burial at Foxfield? I like to break it down conveniently using our tagline, which is a beautiful resting place, a meaningful legacy as nature intended. We prioritize being a nature preserve first and foremost. That's why people come to us, is because they value nature or they value the simplicity of returning to the earth. But we want to make sure that that space is restored to, a really lovely depiction of what makes Ohio such a biodiverse place. It is also a very powerful way to honor and remember your loved one. I have had countless burials out in the middle of our prairie, and as we're lowering someone into the earth, dozens of monarch butterflies will fly over, or people will comment on how the tall blue stem grass sways in the wind, or that when they see the milkweed at Foxfield in bloom and then they see it on their way home, they know that their loved one is represented everywhere they go. They love the seasonality of it. They love coming in the spring to see the spiderwort, and they love coming in the fall to see the leaves change. The passage of time that is seen and represented at Foxfield helps them in their grieving process too. It gives them opportunities to build rituals and to bring their families out and learn about how nature is changing around them. It is also the meaningful legacy because burials at Foxfield, 50% of it is going to fund conservation efforts by the Wilderness Center and also support the nature education efforts of the Wilderness Center. So not only does your family get to benefit from being in that space, you are helping a classroom of kids trudge around in muck boots and carry dip nets and learn about invertebrates. They come out and they help do seed collection, or you invite the local hikers out to, do their birding or do their nature photography or do, forest bathing practices. That is the legacy we want to have, which is community and nature coexisting. And then finally, as nature intended, because our goal is not to impede the return to the earth in any way. We want no embalming, no vaults, and only biodegradable material entering that grave. We want to embrace the fact that we are part of a natural cycle. I can talk a lot about what is a natural burial and what does it mean, but I think hearing it in the words of a family who has had someone buried at Foxfield is far more meaningful. And so I'm going to share this testimonial from one of our families, and I think it paints a really lovely picture of what we try to do for everybody here. From the first visit, Ken and I were struck by the beauty and peacefulness of the location. The site is now a very sacred place for us, our extended family, and our closest friends. Many have visited and all have shared their powerful experiences of peace and understanding. The children and I have been able to plant a special tree at the forest site, and we have made many trips back. I often feel Ken's presence when we visit. And I think that alone says it better than I ever could. So what is the impact of natural burial. Shockingly, it is far easier to tell you what it doesn't do because it is so simple. And so I like to show you what our everyday funeral practices are doing to our planet because we eliminate all of the following. So the very first thing that is very common with natural burial is, or I'm sorry, with conventional burial is embalming. Embalming is a highly invasive procedure, first of all, and I don't think many people are aware of how invasive it can be. I'm going to spare you the details on it because I don't want you to feel bad about it. I don't want you to feel bad if you chose this for somebody. You were honoring someone's wishes, or you were doing so in your best efforts. But it is something that you should know because you have a right to know what happens with your body. It's called autonomy, and you get to make those decisions. So I think a lot of people think that embalming is essentially the replacement of your blood by making a small incision in your neck, and then your artery, the fluid goes in the artery, and the blood comes out of the vein. That does happen. That is the arterial aspect of embalming. But there is also internal cavity embalming, which is the removal of fluids from the organs inside of you because your body is full of bacteria that will cause decomposition. And so to delay that, that needs to be removed. In its place, embalming fluid is put in. And then in the last few stages of the embalming practice, they need to make sure none of those fluids get out. They'll seal up the stitch in the neck, they'll seal up the small incision in the stomach, and they'll also put perhaps cotton in the ears, the nose, the mouth, other places. And they will also, use some cosmetic practices to give off a lively appearance. Sometimes that's the use of plastic caps in the eyes, the wiring of the mouth, different things like that. All of it is really unnecessary. Let's think back to earlier when I said that embalming was used as a solution to a logistical transportation problem. The heat and humidity of train cars needed to be delayed. That decomposition effect needed to be delayed. We are no longer in an era where that is really our primary concern because we have mass refrigeration. Our body preservation techniques have advanced, so you can keep an unembalmed body in refrigeration for a number of weeks and still have a natural burial. And even if you decide after this presentation that I don't really want a natural burial, but embalming still doesn't seem like the right decision for me, guess what? There are no state laws requiring you to be embalmed. The main reason people are embalmed today is for the sake of a public viewing, to have that kind of pink and plumped up appearance for when you are viewed in your casket. But it is not necessary to preserve your body. Another misconception is that embalming will delay decomposition or stop it entirely. It will delay decomposition for a short period of time, that is true, but your body will still decay. Your body will sit in that casket and in that vault and decay, and it won't go anywhere. Whereas when you have a natural burial, without those chemicals, your body kind of just diffuses back into the earth. There are bacteria and little other microbes in that soil that will return it to the earth in a much cleaner way. So, moving on from just those basic things, embalming fluid is also a carcinogen. So this exposes embalmers and crematory operators to the carcinogenic chemical quite often, and we've seen health effects from that. We also see it get introduced into the soil, roughly, 827,000 gallons each year into the soil. Again, Those caskets and those vaults are not watertight. Water gets in and fluid goes out. It is just a known fact that cemeteries leach those fluids. Let's talk containers for a minute. Concrete vaults and liners, while you could argue are a natural material, take thousands of years to break down. We also use enough concrete in burial vaults to build a 2-lane highway from Detroit to New York City, which is just over 1.5 million tons every year. We also use enough metal in the construction of these caskets and burial vaults to rebuild the Golden Gate Bridge every year, roughly 90,000 tons. There is so much material that is being manufactured and the waste associated with that manufacturing practice, as well as what is just sitting in the earth for these burials, and it's doing nothing. We also see quite widespread deforestation to meet the needs of the industry to build board feet of hardwood for caskets. And so, we are harvesting rare old growth trees, roughly 20 million board feet worth. And we use about 4 million acres of forest every year to have enough casket wood. And again, all of it is just sitting there. The US has roughly 1 million acres of cemetery property, full of those concrete, metal, wood, thousands of tons of it. A typical 10-acre cemetery has enough casket steel and concrete and enough wood to be equivalent to 1,000 tons, 20,000 tons, and 40 homes. That's just a lot of stuff in the ground. Not to mention that these cemeteries are really just fields and fields of concrete or stone markers with chemicals applied and mowing applied that keep it perfectly polished. There are no pollinator habitats giving back. Those spaces are not really community recreational spaces at all. They just sit. They continue to take. They continue to be places of sorrow rather than places of life. And I hear from people all the time that it makes them uncomfortable to go to cemeteries now after they've been to a place like Foxfield, which seemed far more natural to them than anything that we currently do in our modern burial practices. Also, I once sold a plot to someone who mowed cemeteries professionally, who said that it doesn't make any sense the amount of fuel and care and hours that go into cemetery maintenance as we know it. They found it incredibly wasteful. And that's a firsthand experience from somebody whose job it is 40 hours a week to go and mow these cemeteries. Again, they just don't really make sense for the scale that we operate on. The last thing that I'll talk about in terms of impact is going to be cremation. And this is where it gets a little sticky because people often think that natural burial means just full bodies. And it's true that the vast majority of people choosing a natural burial are choosing to have their full body buried. But that doesn't mean we don't accept cremains. At Foxfield, we do accept cremains for burial and for scattering in our communal garden space. This is because it's just really good business. We don't want to alienate the people who choose cremation because there's nothing wrong with choosing cremation. There's nothing wrong with making an autonomous decision about how you want your body to be disposed. However, it is the most popular option. Over 60% of Americans are going to choose cremation this year. And cremation, as we know it on the vast operating scale, is fire cremation. And this emits pollutants like carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. It can also cause vaporization of chemicals in your body like mercury into methyl mercury, which can cause acid rain and other bad things to the environment. And if you were embalmed, that formaldehyde in the embalming fluid will also vaporize. It is not a sustainable practice for the amount of people who will be cremated this year, let alone for the number of people who will be cremated in the decades to follow. So we need alternatives because people will always want to be cremated. Alternative technology is on the rise, and I like to talk about it in this presentation because you as a consumer should know what your rights are and advocate for the wider accessibility of these services. So some of these technologies are known as human composting, which would be returning your body to soil on an expedited scale. And the after product is soil rather than ash. Then there's also aquamation, which would reduce the soft tissues of your body using hot water and lye. And the end product is similar to what you get with fire cremation. They are cremulated bone fragment and ash, essentially. So fire cremation and aquamation will be the same byproduct. Human composting is a little different. Your byproduct is soil. So yeah, really great stuff because it mitigates all of these pollutants that are being put out. However, I will say none of these things are really available in Ohio. And what I'm going to say might be controversial, but do not go out and send your body out of state to be aquamated or human composted for the sake of reducing your carbon footprint. You will create a far larger carbon footprint doing that than you would if you picked the fire cremation. I want to make you aware of what the alternative technology is so that you can advocate for it being brought to Ohio and for those services to be expanded in many locations throughout Ohio. Sometimes I hear people say, I've made arrangements to be flown to California for this, and that kind of defeats the purpose. It's like buying your food. You want organic, but you also want local, you know? So to kind of summarize and end our impact, I'm going to throw a few more numbers at you. And this is really talking about what our Foxfield families have done for the good of their community and for the planet. So the Wilderness Center is the recipient of 50% of the funds at Foxfield. And through that programming, we've been able to plant 3,500 trees, provide over 31,000 student experiences, and we help to fund and protect the restoration of 18,000 acres in Ohio and in the neighboring states. And so that is the legacy that people contribute to rather than letting it all go to those wasted green spaces in cemeteries. It is a legacy that lives on through the actions and embodiment of values that you held in your life. Finally, to kind of close on impact, I like to share this story of one of our Foxfield families who, they lost their adult son unexpectedly, and they just were able to have such a full circle moment at Foxfield. And I think really embodies why it's so unique that we have this partnership. So I'll read it for you now. Following graveside services, attendees moved to one of the picnic shelters at the Wilderness Center to share light refreshments and fellowship. A group of school children walked past the shelter with dip nets slung over their shoulders and clunky borrowed muck boots on their feet, on their way to a field trip class on aquatic insects and water quality. The family proudly announced that the proceeds of Jason's burial helped to make the education and conservation programs of our parent organization possible. Everyone could see the meaningful impact firsthand in the smiles of those children. So that puts the impact into better words than I ever could. and far better than any number I could throw at you. So now we're going to jump into the natural burial process. We're entering the latter half of this presentation. So remember that I like to break this down into three things: before the burial, during the burial, and after a burial. So this is everything before that. Somebody has died. What do I do if I'm pursuing a natural burial? The very first thing that I'm going to tell you to do is to pause. This is one of your last opportunities to really sit and be present with your loved one. When you decide to pick up the phone and call a funeral director or call in, Foxfield, you are going to be asked a million questions. You're going to have to make a million decisions. The very first thing I want you to do after somebody has died is to just take your time without needing any of that pressure to gather your loved ones, reflect on that person's life, and just grieve for a minute. There is a misconception that when somebody dies, you need to handle the emergency. I hate to be the one to tell you, but after someone has died, the emergency has kind of stopped. Take that time. No one is going to rapidly decompose before your eyes. It's okay to take several hours before you call someone. When you are ready, you can call a funeral home, or you can call your home funeral guide, and you can contact me at Foxfield. We will guide you through the next few steps. There are going to be some decisions that need to be made regardless of pre-planning. I'm assuming all of your pre-planning has been done. Pre-planning is when you come to me at Foxfield and you say, I want plot number 1, and I'm going to be buried in a casket, and I've already talked to the funeral director, and I've prepaid for my casket, and he knows what song I want to have played at my burial, and I've already picked the cotton dress that I'm going to be wearing. That's the pre-planning aspect. Decisions still need to be made when somebody dies, though. The biggest gift that you can give to your family is eliminating those hard financial decisions and let them decide on other things, like when will the service be? Do we want to have white flowers at the burial, or do we want to have yellow flowers at the burial? What tie should dad have on? Different things like that. The big financial decisions are what can really be hard and split families. And the greatest gift that you can give to your loved ones is the peace of mind of knowing that it's already taken care of if you have the accessibility of means to do so. There are some essential tasks that need to happen in order for a natural burial to occur. And these are going to be pretty much the same thing that happens when anybody dies and they're pursuing whatever burial or cremation option they want. I'm going to now refer only to using a funeral home, but all of this could happen with a home funeral guide or a death doula. It's just more common for our families to work with a funeral home. If you're interested in a home funeral option, I can definitely connect you with resources on it, but for the sake of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the most common situations. So, all of these tasks are essentially happening simultaneously. And really, your funeral director is handling a lot of it for you, so you don't have to worry about it. But just so that you know what's happening, there's going to be transportation from place of death. Most people are dying in a hospital, in a nursing home, or at their home. They need to be transported to the funeral home for care, to be kept in refrigeration. If you're doing the home funeral, you might take them out of the hospital and return them to your home for care. That would be the alternative. So, your funeral director is making sure that they are following all the guidelines on transportation, and they are also following all the guidelines for care of the body. Now, a body will require a cool environment like refrigeration, or for the home funeral, kept on ice and in an air-conditioned space, or if it's wintertime, open a few windows. A body will also need to be washed, dressed, and placed in the burial container. I used to work inside of a funeral home, and I would often tell people, do you want to come and style mom's hair? Or do you want to come and tie dad's tie? Do you want to paint mom's fingernails? There are opportunities for you to get involved in the care of your loved one if you would like it. And almost every funeral home that I have worked with is going to say, yes, of course you can come in and do this. You can be involved in whatever level you want. If you're doing it all at home by yourself, you have to do all of these things. But if it was really important for you to be involved in some way, like washing your loved one or helping to get them ready for their burial, ask. It is always okay to ask what you can do. Then there's documentation. A death certificate needs to be obtained from the Department of Vital Statistics and signed by a physician or nurse on the case, and that needs to be filed with the county. Once that's filed, a burial permit is released. The burial permit is essentially the golden ticket. In the state of Ohio, this doubles as the transportation permit, and that allows the funeral director to bring the body to the cemetery for burial. That is the document that I need, which is why I say it's the golden ticket. Another opportunity for you to be involved in the burial service is you can actually do the transportation yourself. If you're doing the home funeral, you're doing all of this anyway. If you're working with the funeral director, you can ask them to put the casket in your truck because you want to give dad one last ride. We've had families do that. You just need that burial permit. And if you're doing all of this home funeral work yourself, sometimes the documentation process can get red tapey. It's really difficult sometimes. Sometimes it's enough just to engage a funeral director to help you through that process or to help you with the transportation. You could even ask them to refrigerate the body and then bring it to your home for a wake. There are different opportunities. Have conversations with service providers, whether that be the funeral director or a death doula or a home funeral guide. No question is silly, okay? It is within your rights to ask and be curious about what could happen with your remains. So what happens on the day of a burial service? So everybody has come to Foxfield Preserve. We actually meet at the Wilderness Center's offices first because this has the bathrooms. It's the first sign of civilization people have probably seen in about 2 hours after driving down here. This makes sure that everybody is there. We get them lined up for the processional. So we're gonna gather there. And then we're gonna make our way up to the cemetery. I'm gonna be your guide the whole way. I'm gonna make sure your family gets to the grave, that you get to the grave, the funeral director's there. And that's pretty much where I stop because we leave how you honor your loved ones up to your direction. There is no set model that you have to follow. There are no suits and ties. There are no heels and tights that you are bound by. You can come and sit and play your camp guitar. You can come and play and have a bagpiper play to you. You can pass around photos or packets of seeds. You can read poems. It's up to you. And there's no time constraint. There's no pressure. We want you to have the opportunity to honor your loved one in whatever way you feel is representational to them. Or if you're planning it all yourself, how you want to be honored, what rules and directions you want people to follow. I had one family who came down to do their mother's burial, and within the file that I kept in her pre-arrangements, she had written them a poem. And in my direction was to give them that poem towards the end of the service. And they were able to read what her first reaction was to Foxfield and how she thought of the clover that grew at her home and what it would mean to her to know that her loved ones were there for her and how desperately she wanted to be there with them too. Um, Different things like that, I'm not going to say what you can and can't do in that sense. So long as you don't burn down my forest, you can do whatever you want. And as long as whatever is going in that grave is natural and whatever kind of activity happens after everybody leaves is natural, you can do whatever you want. The last thing that we do on a burial service is we close the grave. Sometimes this is done entirely by hand, and we really encourage people to take the opportunity to close the grave as much as they feel is comfortable. Our staff will finish closing a grave using machinery once everybody has left, because sometimes it is a really big job to ask people to do, but a lot of people will finish closing a grave by hand. These are some details on burial specifications. All of our plots are 10 feet by 20 feet, which is much larger than you're going to find at any cemetery. And this is because we need to navigate the landscape that we have. There are oftentimes lots of trees that we need to make sure we're digging around, sometimes rock shelves, sometimes a very rare plant that we can't cut down. That's why we need wiggle room with big plots. Every plot is sectioned off, numbered, and GPS marked so that you can always find it. Graves are dug to the sides of the container, roughly 4 feet by 7 feet within that 10 by 20 rectangle. And the depth is 3.5 to 4 feet. Another misconception is that graves are 6 feet deep. That doesn't even really happen in conventional cemeteries. That's really far down to go. The state minimum is 3.5. This is also just happens to be the most active soil layer. So it's full of those good microbes, the spores, the bacteria, everything that we need for your body to diffuse back and return to the earth. In addition, that big mound of earth covered in pine that you see to the right of the open grave gets piled on top. That's going to add about 18 to 24 inches of height. And when you add that up, that's roughly 6 feet. And so that's going to prevent any smell from getting out. It prevents animals from getting in. There are no recorded cases of animal activity in any natural burial ground. They are simply not interested in doing that much work to get a meal. And the mounds keep the heat and moisture inside of the grave to, again, expedite that decomposition process. And over time, they will flatten and return to the earth all by itself. The earth knows what to do with our bodies far better than we do. For graveside services, pallbearers are going to carry from the funeral home's service vehicle over to the open grave. The deceased is going to be laid across these 3 boards so that they are above ground for the duration of the services. And when the family decides they are ready to have them lowered, I will remove those wooden boards. The body will be suspended using those green ropes, just a couple of inches hovering over, and then slowly by hand, those straps will be released until that person is lying gently on top of another mound of fresh cut pine and flowers to be on a beautiful soft bed of greenery. And the closing will be a process where we take that earth either handful by handful, shovel by shovelful, or later closed by my staff to tuck your loved one into the earth. I always encourage people to at least go one at a time around the circle of attendees, but if it's not something you're comfortable with, you are not obligated to do so. But it does mean a lot. Oftentimes in our modern burial practices, we are walking away from the grave before that person is even lowered into the ground. There's a tent, there's green astroturf. It feels very surreal. This is a way of getting physical closure, and it connects your mind to your body in the act of returning them and knowing that you are in a grieving cycle, that this is the conclusion of something. To kind of re-emphasize the importance of the closing process, this is another story from one of our families that I'll read to you now. At the end of the prepared words, a mother stepped forward and took up a shovel. Everyone in attendance watched as she placed the first few shovels of earth on his casket. In that moment, she felt like she was tucking her son in for the last time, that laying him to rest at Foxfield had brought her a great sense of comfort. Um, that is like one of the biggest things that people tell us is how much it meant to them to be able to do that and to see their friends and families share the physical labor of death with them and to see the grief embodied in that last act. And so it really is a service to your friends and family when you participate that I think our modern funeral industry really robs families of. So what do we do after a burial? And I know I'm running a little behind. I appreciate your patience, but what do we do after the burial? There are several options for memorials. We encourage you to return. The preserve is open to you and to the public from dawn to dusk. And it's really lovely to see how that space is changing over time and to see your loved one's legacy in action every time you see the prairie is being managed, or you see new trees being planted, or again, that people are just enjoying the space. And then share your experiences. Talk about natural burial with your friends and families. Tell them what the experience was like for you. And also just talk about your loved one. Share what their life was like, share what they meant to you, and have frank conversations about grief, because how we handle grief is also really weird. We are in a culture of death denial. So these are some examples of memorials that we have at Foxfield. Our stones are rough cut and unpolished, natural stone. Native flowers or grasses can be planted anywhere within the preserve. And in the sections that are managed as forest, you can plant native trees. We do have a list that specifies which ones because we have different land requirements. We don't want cultivars, different things like that. What are your natural burial options? We're nearing the last little bit, so I'm going to breeze through these so we can get to the Q&A portion. This is a shroud. This is usually a natural fiber like cotton or linen. Sometimes it's muslin or silk that gets wrapped around your body. It is the most minimal container that you can have. Inside of that shroud is a wooden board to have some stability as we carry over to the grave, and also as you are lined on those three boards over the open grave. It's going to provide that stability and the rigidity needed to do that. It is a requirement that you have the wooden board in there. I emphasize that a lot in our conversations with families. It is also great if you have carrying handles on the shroud. That's the other requirement. Now, in the photo here, this is a shroud that is designed intentionally for natural burial. This is a product that you can buy. However, you can just be buried in a natural fiber quilt or 100% cotton sheets, something like that. If this is an example of kind of what that would look like, the only requirements that I would have in addition to this would be that you tie additional pieces of fabric to create carrying handles, or you use like a hempen rope. And then also that wooden board would need to be slipped in there. And that's really easy to acquire because you can just go to Lowe's or your hardware store and get like a 5-foot long, 5-inch wide, half-inch thick board. It doesn't need to be anything crazy. And oftentimes funeral directors will just go and get this piece for you. This is an example of a wooden casket. Wooden caskets can be purchased. They can also be made. So if you are a carpenter you can do this. Sometimes people will build them as bookcases to have during their life, and then you can pull the shelves out and use it as the casket later. These caskets do not have blues or finish, stain. They are like a soft wood, pine. Often a Jewish Orthodox casket is perfect because those are all natural wood caskets as well. This is an example of a natural fiber woven casket like bamboo or hemp, um, wicker, things like that. If you're really good at weaving, I suppose you could also make your own wicker casket, but oftentimes they're purchased. And these are often the most expensive option because it's an artisan craft, but they are often still cheaper than a lot of conventional caskets. The last full body burial option is a cardboard casket, also sometimes known as an alternative container or a cremation casket. These are really great because every funeral home is going to have access to these because they are used to transport somebody to the crematorium. And they're flat pack. You could take them home if you want. Somebody could be home on hospice and you could pick one of these up. And as people come to visit, they can take time to draw on it or reflect on that somebody's life with a poem they want to write on there. It's really beautiful and is my personal favorite option to recommend to families. If you are choosing cremation, urns are optional for burial. You can just have your ashes poured directly into the earth. And honestly, that's our preference because we can mix the soil up and create channels in it for roots and water to get through the ashes. If you don't like that idea, that's okay too. You can choose something like a paper urn, which is on the left, or in the middle, that is an urn that is made out of cornstarch, essentially. And then in the far right, your traditional kind of unfinished wooden casket or wooden urn could be used. The last option for cremains would be a scattering, and this is done when ashes are just poured over top of the land, usually within our community garden, but could happen in a plot that you've purchased. This is the services and pricing sheet. I'm not going to go over this too in depth because this is broken down honestly better in your planning guide that was sent to you in the email with the link to this presentation. So just review that, and if you have questions on it, you can let me know. But the one thing that I do want to cover on this has to do with the difference between burial rites and burial preparations. So when you're pre-planning at Foxfield, you are pre-planning by purchasing the rights to be buried on that plot. I can collect that money from you in advance. What I cannot collect from you in advance is the burial preparation fee. That is the physical opening of the grave and the preparation of that grave. However, you can pay that to the funeral home. It's different and weird laws for the state of Ohio in terms of what the cemetery can have prepaid for and what the funeral home can have prepaid for. So those are some important things to know. The other thing to know is what exactly, a common question I get is what is first rights and what is second rights? So as a reminder, our plots are 10 feet by 20 feet. That means that there is room for one full body burial on it. That's the first right. And you can purchase for an additional $250 a second right to bury on that plot. And you could put one set of cremated remains on that plot. Or, and I'm going to use an example of perhaps a married couple, perhaps you both want cremation. You can have one plot with both sets of your cremated remains on it for first and second rights. However, if you are a married couple who both want natural burial, our plots are not large enough to accommodate two full bodies, so you would each need your own plot. That's kind of what this picture is showing you. The blue rectangle is one plot, and you have the option of fitting one full body on it and one set of cremated remains, or 2 sets of cremated remains. Cost comparison, this is also in your planning guide. Because we eliminate so many of those accessory costs, like the concrete vault, and there's no embalming, our burial containers are more affordable. Your natural burial is going to be thousands of dollars less. The average one, I would say, is about $4,000 to $5,000 versus a conventional burial is going to run you at least $10,000. So what are some next steps? If you are interested in pursuing Foxfield, review the materials on our website in the planning guide that was attached to the email I sent to you. It's also on the website. Visit our preserve, schedule an appointment, talk with other service providers, ask them for their generalized price list. The preserve is open for self-guided walks every day, but if you want an appointment to come out and finalize the arrangements, you can do so on our website or by calling and emailing. Complete your purchase. I try to make that as easy as possible for you. And then tell your friends and family, because a natural burial is often something that they haven't run into before, and they need to know what exactly to expect. And if you need help in having that conversation with them, I'm happy to do so. So I'm going to leave the recap slide up as we do the Q&A, but I do want to point out that next Wednesday we're doing a public guided tour. And so that will be me with a similar group of people walking the actual preserve and telling you about the different sections, what to expect. It's a really great opportunity to get out there and see it. You can register for it online on our website, or you can call and I'll help you register for it. If you can't make the one on September 13th, we will have another in October as well as November. You can see those dates on the website as well. So I'm going to allow you all to unmute if you want to. I will also allow for you to send questions in the chat. So you should be able to unmute and ask a question if you have it. And also, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat.
I have a question. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Hi. So one thing is a little confusing to me. Do I need to go through a funeral home as well as through you, or?
Yes, because we are the final resting place. We are the cemetery. We are not able to pick up your body from a nursing home after you have died. We do not hold the licenses to do that. You need to make arrangements with either a funeral director to do so, or your friends and families will have to engage in the home funeral.
Okay. So, okay, thank you.
Well, you're welcome. John.
Hannah, you did a great job. Appreciate your information, and we'll be in touch through the website.
Great. Thank you so much for attending.
You bet. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
So, oh, does anyone else have one before I ask my second one?
I do. My name's Kimberly. As far as the home, because I'm caring for my father, and if I decided to allow him to pass away at home, it was, I guess I'm confused too. Then could it be myself, and it could then be myself and my family to transport the body to Foxfield Preserve, or I would have to go through the funeral home?
You could do the transportation yourself. There are a few options, and I would be happy to follow up with you a little more personally on it to give you more direction, but you have a few options.
Mhm.
You could have your funeral home do all of the work essentially. They could come and pick your father up from the home after he has died.
Mhm.
They could take care of his remains and put him in the casket for you. And
Mhm.
what you can do on the day of the burial is drive to the funeral home, ask them to put him in your vehicle of choice, and they'll give you the burial permit and they will have you sign a release form. The release form is saying that the funeral home is no longer in possession of the remains, that you are, and you are responsible for getting it to Foxfield. Or
Mhm.
you could ask that the funeral home come with you, but just not do the transportation. You could, for example, with the truck, the casket could be in the back of the truck and you could be driving it down, but the funeral directors are in a car behind you because you want their assistance still. Um, you can just have pretty frank conversations with the funeral director in terms of what you want to do. Um,
Mhm.
so those are your kind of options.
Okay. 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 But
That Go ahead.
okay, because I'm really comfortable like with even when my dad time comes, even doing it myself. Like
Mm,
if I could avoid all of that, I guess that's what I'm saying. Can I avoid a funeral director? Can I avoid that and just do everything myself? Or
Yes, you
okay.
absolutely can. You can absolutely give your father a home funeral and do the home burial practice. What I will recommend you do, since this is not exactly my area of expertise,
Mhm.
is I can refer you over to the National Home Funeral Alliance.
Okay.
This group of people will be full of educators who will help you, you know, cool the body and care for the body until the time of the burial. They will also make you aware of the policies in Ohio that could affect the timeline for the burial.
Mhm.
The biggest thing to be aware of in the state of Ohio is that there is a rule that says that if you are not working with a funeral director, you need to do burial within 48 hours.
Mhm.
That can sometimes be challenging because, say, your father died over a long weekend, like we just had.
Right.
The Department of Vital Statistics may not be open within 48 hours for you to get the death certificate, let alone to get filed for the burial permit. So
Okay.
it is oftentimes worth engaging the funeral home to help you with the documentation process so that you have an extended timeline. They're so used to working within the systems near you that that's often priceless. But I would highly recommend having a conversation with someone at the National Home Funeral Alliance because they're going to be able to better speak to the exact things that you need to do. That is a far more specialized thing than I have expertise in.
And do you have like a listing of funeral homes that you work with or that are kind of understanding of this whole situation or
Yeah, so the list on our website is not complete. Am still working on uploading a few of those. We've got a relatively new website.
oh
So I have a full list that I can send to people, but what I prefer to know is where you are located, and I can give you my personal recommendations of the ones that I've really enjoyed working with.
okay, that's what I want.
So just follow up in an email with me and say like, who have you worked with in Massillon that you really like? And I can give you kind of like three that come to mind.
Okay.
What I tell families too is you do not need to choose a funeral home simply because they have worked with us before or because they have something known as green burial certification. That's essentially continuing education credits they took. Um, Choose someone who you feel comfortable with, who is in close distance to your home or to your family's home, who is transparent with you in their pricing. Because the last thing you want to have to do when you're grieving is to go to someone that you find icky, who's 3 hours away, just because he was on my list. Go to someone you trust. Natural burial is very simple to do. It really doesn't require them to do much. The biggest question that I get asked by funeral homes who have never done one before is, how do I handle a shroud? How do I shroud them? How do I transport it to you? Things like that. And that is often the same question I get from the ones who have worked with us a million times or the ones who are green burial certified. When you decide to work with somebody who is not on our list, you are also expanding the number of service providers who become aware of the option, who can then offer it to other families. So don't just let what is on my list deter you from contacting people outside of it. Because oftentimes the most enthusiastic supporters of natural burial have come from funeral homes who didn't even know we existed. And the families who pick them are giving them the opportunity to tell other families too.
Yeah, the reason I ask is because I am not comfortable with one of the local ones that I know of, so I'm looking for somebody other than that.
And
Yeah.
I'm happy to give you a referral as well.
Great.
I genuinely really love some of the ones that I work with. And so I'm happy to refer them to people when I can, because they are good and enthusiastic supporters. But again, really emphasizing somebody you trust, someone who is supportive of your decision, and someone who is going to be transparent with you on the pricing and isn't going to try to upsell or anything like that.
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Are there
And
any other? Yeah, Kimberly.
on average, how much would a funeral home uh charge for just simple, the simplicity of it?
Yeah,
Because I'm
so this
trying to
is,
keep it
I
as
can't,
simple as possible.
of course, that is a great question. So the question was, what is like the average funeral home going to charge you for burial? Um, Not every funeral home has the exact same prices. So a funeral home up in Cleveland may be drastically different than one in Canton, but it's generally somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 for their services. That's a general direct burial package. There might be a slight upcharge on it depending on the container that you pick and also the distance from Foxfield that you are. Because of the mileage they may charge for transportation or the mileage that they will charge for the pickup of your remains. So Pam, I don't know where you're located, but for
Cleveland.
example, if you're in Cleveland and you pick a funeral home in Canton, that's outside their normal service range. They may charge you a little bit more to do that pickup. Or if you're in Toledo, Ohio, and your funeral home is driving you down to Wilmot, that's usually more than their service range. So they may charge you for the mileage. So I can't speak to an exact number, but somewhere between 35 and 5 would be about what they would charge, I would imagine. And you can find a generalized price list on almost every funeral home's website, or you can ask that they send it to you. They are required by the Federal Trade Commission to send you that generalized price list. And so you can really see line by line what they charge for you in those packages. So just call around and ask for a bunch of them and see what works best for you.
Okay. Okay.
Are there other questions? If there are any questions that come to mind, you can always call or email me. I can also do a personal Q&A over Zoom if you prefer that. You can make that appointment on the website as well. And you can also come and just do an appointment for like a plot selection. You can come down to the preserve and walk it with me. And there's no pressure to buy at that appointment. We can put some plots on hold for you and just have some conversations because this is a big decision to make. And I want the people who come to us to feel very comfortable moving forward with that decision. So don't be afraid to come to me with your questions. and don't be afraid to need to take time to make it.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you
Well,
so
I hope you all have a great rest of your night. Thank you so much for coming. Again, don't hesitate to reach out should you need anything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great night.